Frank Netto, well known to all of you, talking about the promise of a plant-based diet.
Great, thanks very much, Carl, for inviting me here this morning. I have a lot of slides to get through. We're just going to kind of click through them. It should be a lot of fun. We're talking about Better Brain. We'll talk an update on the blueberry research that has been done. It's very exciting. Some human trials now being completed. We'll talk a bit about a healthier heart and a greener planet and the promise of a plant-based diet. I'll just kind of disclaimer here, I'm not a complete vegetarian, but I think the concept is to try and incorporate more plant foods as protein source. Also, I wanted to say hi to Kathy, who's in the audience here, who's great, who should take a bow here. She runs the Blue Moon Cafe just down here in Exeter, and does a wonderful job providing just the healthiest food imaginable to the area. So that's really where the rubber hits the road in terms of getting healthy food out there. I also want to briefly mention at the end of the talk a bit on omega-3s, vitamin D, and how I replace vitamin D. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and then just a bit on the Vieta controversy. So I think ideas can change civilization. One of the seminal books in terms of changing the way we think about food was this book, which I used to sell in my little natural food store, called Diet for a Small Planet. This was way back in the 1970s, I guess, when it came out, which kind of made a connection between the food that we eat and the stress on the environment overall. So the question is, should we go, vegetarian, or why should we be eating, choosing vegetarian burritos instead of beef burritos when we're out there? Certainly, vegetarianism is something that's gotten a lot of press out there. There are thought to be about 5 million adults in the U.S. who are vegetarian. If you go to India, which is of course becoming more and more of an economic powerhouse, there's about 400 million Indians who are vegetarian. Certainly we've had some brilliant people who have looked to vegetarianism. Albert Einstein, so I am living without fats, without meat, without fish, but I'm feeling quite well this way. It always seems to me that man was not born to be a carnivore. And I'll kind of show you a few slides that kind of point in that direction. Here's a quote from Benjamin Franklin where he says, "My refusing to eat flesh occasionally inconveniency, and I was frequently chid for my singularity." That's sort of not the way we talk today, but it does point to, there, and you can look through, the history books and just find that there are so many very brilliant people who were more prone to be vegetarian. We also have some comic characters. That's it. I can't live in this house with this prehistoric carnivore. I'm out of here. So this kind of vegetarianism can lead to some family, stress as well. So just the introductory part of this talk is, why a plant-based diet? Well, one concern is about the animals, second is about health, and then third, about the world in general. So talking about animals, one thing to point out is how many animals are actually being, killed each year for food, just for the U.S. About 10 million rabbits, about 40 million cattle, about 120 million pigs. So when we think about, foods and food availability, we think, well, it all depends on the number of people in the world. And if you have more people eating more food, then that stresses the planet because we have to feed. But actually, the real stress on the planet is feeding all these animals so that we can then eat them. That's where the stress on the planet comes, not so much from eating the animals themselves, the plants themselves are growing the plant-based food itself. About 300 million turkeys, and the winner is, as you might guess, of course, the chicken. 10 billion chicken, just to feed the U.S. population. That's about 40 million per workday. And of course, there's a quote here from Paul McCartney. I decided not to show you, the really gross slides and such, and really delve into this. You certainly could if anybody's, more interested in this guy named John Robbins, who's the son of the Baskin-Robbins group. He actually wrote a book called Diet for a New America, which just outlines, in great detail, the animal industry. Here's a quote from Paul McCartney, which says, "Where slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be a vegetarian. because of the incredible cruelty, like little male chicks exactly have no economic value, whatever. So they'll be fed into like chippers, whatever, like 30,000 at a time, whatever. They're just of no value. So I think a lot of us are eating this because we have this idea in our head that we just have to have huge amounts of protein in our diet. This is a quote from William Shakespeare. He is a heavy eater of beef, methinks it doth harm to his wit. And we'll talk about some of the diseases, cancer and other diseases that people who are heavy meat eaters tend to have more of. You can find proteins in nature, which tastes great. Actually, you tend to have a diet that has more variety if you're eating more of a plant-based diet. So you find proteins in nuts, you find it in beans and legumes, green beans, lentils, black beans, chickpeas. Also grains is part of the Frances Moore LePay concept in her book was that if you eat beans and you eat whole grains together, you get complete protein. And that doesn't have to be at the same meal. You can have beans at one meal, you can have grains at the next, and together you get a complete protein. So you don't need to have so much meat. As far as for your health goes, I think that many of us, we're concerned about this big protein deficiency that we might have, but in fact, we're much more likely to have a fiber deficiency. It's thought that people should get about 35 grams of protein in their diet per day, but the average American gets only about 12 to 15. It's really essential for good health, plays a vital role in maintaining cardiovascular and digestive health. There's some evidence that higher fiber diets help to protect from metabolic syndrome and diabetes. Certainly, adequate fiber intake is important for healthy weight maintenance. It tends to increase the sense of fullness that a person has, and maintain normal cholesterol and normal glycemic response after eating carbohydrates. This is one of the studies that looks at a log of insulin sensitivity and dietary fiber. So this is, suggests an amazing relationship here between the amount of fiber that you eat and how sensitive you are to insulin. So the more fiber that you have, the higher insulin sensitivity. So beef, it's what's in your colon. So a lot of people, I think, are walking around, they have a very, very low fiber diet. They're just congested, they're just full of these rotting animal products. It's not a very healthy thing. There is some evidence that just changing to a whole grains in your diet, actually changing from white flour bread to whole wheat bread leads to reduction in weight. And here in one study, actually 14 grams of fiber a day was associated with a 10% decrease in energy intake and a loss of 1.9 kilos over 3.8 months just by simply adding more fiber to the diet. We know that vegetarians have lower rates of hypertension. They have lower mortality from ischemic heart disease. 40% likely overall develop cancer compared to meat eaters. This is a study from Japan looking at Japanese vegetarians, and it did show lower body mass index, lower diastolic blood pressure, lower systolic blood pressure, and better liver function tests as well. So there's a lot of different parameters that are changed, and certainly one of those is colon cancer. If you just think about it, if you have a low fiber diet, you have a lot of putrefying nitrosamines, high toxic materials sitting around in your colon that aren't moving very much because somebody's been on the Atkins diet. There's some people who call the Atkins diet one of the most carcinogenic diets in the world. You can certainly increase your risk of colon cancer if you have a high meat consumption. Turns out that vegetarians seem to be at lower risk for osteoporosis. They tend to have a lower body mass index. One way of thinking about it is that we get all energy from the sun, right? So if you eat the plants themselves, these foods are less concentrated in energy. If you let an animal eat, all this vegetable product and then concentrate the calories and then you eat the animal itself, well then you're basically eating more calories. You're having a more concentrated caloric form in your diet. And so you'll tend to have higher body mass index. You'll tend to be more obese if you eat foods that are more calorically dense. And certainly, beef and saturated fats are very high in calories. In the end, vegetarians live for about 6 to 10 years longer than meat eaters. This is based on the Seventh-day Adventist studies. You do have to be careful about B12, but it's readily available in supplements, and taking multivitamin is a good thing to do. As far as for the world itself, it's actually really quite surprising how meat consumption impacts the world. This is from World Watch 2004. Human appetite for animal flesh is a driving force behind virtually every major category of environmental damage now threatening the human future. We have deforestation. When we think about the tropical rainforest, we think of grassland destruction, we think of waste, we think of global warming, and we think of loss of biodiversity. And a lot of this is actually fueled by our drive to eat more and more meat. So the vast majority of grain harvested in the U.S. is not fed to humans themselves, but it's actually fed to animals. And this is a wasteful and inefficient practice. It's forced agribusiness to exploit vast stretches of land. The quantity, and then also the amount of waste that's produced by raising all these animals is incredible. It's 130 times greater than that produced by humans, the amount of waste that they produce producing this. So certainly this is affecting our rivers and streams. It's having a huge impact on the environment. The other thing I just to mention, Ruth, that I've heard that if you want to fill up an SUV with alcohol to just one tank, the amount of corn that's required to fill up an SUV with one tank full of ethanol is the amount of corn that could feed a human for an entire year. So this idea, I think, of driving, people towards these, alcohol as a source for fuel, just kind of takes this and drives it again even to the more absurd, actually. I mean, the earth can only produce so much grain, and convert it into animals and to convert it into ethanol is really kind of a crazy thing. So in Central America, some 40% of all rainforests have been cleared or burned down in the last 40 years, mostly for cattle pasture to feed the export market for U.S. beef burgers. It's too expensive for the poor in these beef exporting countries, yet in some cases cattle have ousted highly productive traditional agriculture. And it's tremendous, the amount of land and destruction that takes place to produce one hamburger is just amazing. And so you have these incredible tropical rainforests being converted to factories which produce hamburgers instead. So how many human beings could be fed with the grain and soybeans that go into livestock in the U.S.? About 1.3 billion people is what's fed to livestock in the U.S. could be used to feed humans. How many tons of vegetable protein does it take to produce 1 ton of animal protein? It takes about 6 tons of vegetable protein, which you could be using as a protein source for yourself to produce 1 ton of animal protein. How many vegetarians can live on resources needed to feed only one meat eater? It's thought that you could feed about 14 vegetarians for the amount of energy that it takes to feed one meat eater. How about how many gallons of water does it take to produce 1 pound of California beef? Of course, there's huge water shortages in California. It takes about 5,000 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of California beef, but only about 5 to produce 1 pound of wheat. So it's just to make, and in terms of fuel, the average family of 4 requires about 260 gallons of fuel to produce the amount of beef that it takes in. Transport accounts for about 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. How about for livestock farming? Produces 14% of greenhouse gas emissions to produce livestock. 37% of methane, 65% of nitrous oxide, 65% of ammonia. All that means air pollution, soil pollution and loss of the topsoil, water pollution, of course, acid rain. And if we think about 33% of the world's arable land is dedicated to feed crop production. And so if you ate less of that, of course in South America we're losing our rainforest very, very quickly, and all the consequences of that. 70% of deforestation occurs for conversion to livestock pasture, which is a crazy thing to be doing with the rainforests. So certainly there are places now where people eat very healthy lives. The Huntsas, for example, live pretty much a vegetarian lifestyle, and they live well into their 90s overall. So a healthy diet includes a lot of vegetables, fruit, whole grains, maybe a little bit of fish, a little bit of vino. Protein sources like nuts are best of all. If you look at traditional diets, people who are on traditional diets have much less heart disease, longest life expectancy, the lowest rates of cancer overall. It's interesting to note that when Elliot Jocelyn went to Arizona in the 1920s, before the introduction of the surplus beef and cheese from the U.S. government, he found no cases of type 2 diabetes among the Pima Indians. And now, of course, about 60 to 70% of the Pima Indians now have type 2 diabetes. So their change in diet just made a huge difference for them. So, but we have references in old books. I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. I mean, this is from Genesis, so it's a pretty old concept. Which are the natural foods for man? I'd say more plant-based foods. I mean, there's nothing that, if you ever saw a human walking along drinking from a cow, actually, you'd think, wow, that's very odd behavior. I would say, I think that milk is really great food for baby cows. I think there's nothing natural about the idea of drinking milk. Humans certainly have much more the teeth of the vegetarian as opposed to that the teeth of the carnivore. That's again shown here. Certainly the digestive tract of the carnivore is much different than the digestive tract of a human. Our intestines are much longer. They're designed basically to absorb calories from plant-based foods, as opposed to a very short gut of the carnivores, which get that putrefied material through there very quickly. I remember as a resident, we had one person come in about 40 minutes in the field, having swallowed this huge chunk of steak and led to his choking to death on meat, a fairly young man. It turns out that 90% of people who choke to death are while eating are choking to death on meat. So it's something to think about. Carnivores are eating about 30 to 40% of their body weight at one meal, whereas of course humans try to do that but have a harder time. So culture itself was actually born with the cultivation of grain. We had reading, music, and the art lived with the storage of grain one season to the next. And our wells just increased, and we decided, well, you know what, let's feed all our grains to these animals, and then we'll eat the animals. And I think we've done that. And huge increases in the amount of meat that we're eating just in the last 40 or 50 years. Leonardo da Vinci was really ahead of his time, kind of a rock star of his time. We'll come back to him towards the end. He was pretty much a vegetarian. And, I think that to think of your body as a work of art that you should respect, be careful what you feed it. Eat a lot of whole grains. We know that if you eat more whole grains, you have a lower risk of heart disease, lower risk of stroke. This is based on the on Harvard studies, 50-year studies looking at whole grain consumption versus stroke risk in terms of quintiles of whole grain consumption versus risk of stroke. And if you look at more whole grains, you have a lower risk of developing diabetes. More refined grain, about a 1.6-fold increase in the risk of developing diabetes if you have more sugar and white flour in your diet. Try to choose healthy protein sources like legumes, like beans, like nuts, and then eat a lot of vegetables. Way back, Hippocrates, 5th century BC, let food be your medicine and your medicine be your food. And certainly, colors in plants, I'm not going to do a lot of talking on this. I'm going to kind of focus a bit more on the blueberries, but the colors in plants are really protecting that plant from solar radiation and oxidative damage. The nice thing is when we eat these brightly colored fruits and vegetables, we have conveyed to us the antioxidant benefit that protects us from a whole variety of different diseases. So if you're thinking food and healthy food, you want to choose brightly colored fruits and vegetables, like the red-blue anthocyanins found in plants that are red, blue, and purple, like the blueberry. And just to mention a couple of these trials real briefly, there's a transgenic model for Alzheimer's disease where they do wise maze testing, which is quite difficult for these animals to do. The control animals without the defect are scoring about a 59.4. Those who have the Alzheimer's type defect score a 45.2. But if you give those same animals with a defect blueberries, they score 61.2. So they're protected from the Alzheimer's type disease by having the blueberries on board. This is looking at new object exploration in young animals versus middle-aged animals. They have much less tendency to explore. Here they have these animals kind of in a pen, and they actually will change the environment and see how much they explore when they change what's in there. The middle-aged animals, given the blueberries, they explore their environment even more than the young animals. So it seems to turn old brains into younger brains. And there is actually some evidence now that in humans, you can actually, these are older humans with memory deficits with no dementia. And this work is being done in Cleveland, Ohio by a gentleman who does only research in this area with early memory defects. And he's finding, you can see here that those on the blueberries at baseline versus the end have a very significant improvement in their memory with the blueberries, and this is pretty amazing. And just to mention, it's not just a question of just having the blueberries, but it seems like if you have more of these pigments eaten together, like if you mix blueberries, raspberries, and strawberries together, you actually have a synergistic effect, and the anthocyanins and the antioxidants actually act synergistically in terms of providing more antioxidant benefit. And so you can really have a very helpful effect in terms of protecting your body overall. So it seems like with regard to blueberries, you can certainly regenerate the brain to some extent. This is looking at prostate cancer. One of the more intriguing trials is one that's done with pomegranate juice. It's shown that in terms of doubling of PSA, in those who had 8 ounces of pomegranate juice per day, the time to doubling of PSA in those who had the pomegranate juice was about 24 months, whereas with those without the pomegranate juice, it was about 16 months. So there were huge differences in terms of how quickly the prostate cancer is coming back. When we think about prostate, we also think of tomatoes and lycopene. It seems like these pigments actually have an effect in terms of not only protecting from the risk of prostate cancer, but even for people with prostate cancer seems to be protective and allow for a longer lifespan as well. So plants are living in this sea of ultraviolet light that would kill us all, the enormous free radical damage. And if you think about it, really, human disease, whether you're talking cancer, heart disease, or other disease, is really a reflection of a lack of antioxidants and more inflammation going on. With cancer, you have DNA damage. With heart disease, it's really oxidized LDL that gets the inflammatory process going, as reflected in CRP, C-reactive protein. We also have joint disease, which is, of course, an inflammatory process, brain disease, and eye disease. And the idea that if you eat more plants, more brightly colored fruits and vegetables, that you'll have more protection. Generally speaking, I think an interest in eating things that are less cooked probably makes sense. Lycopene is one pigment that is quite heat stable, but most of these other pigments are destroyed by heat quite well. So the idea, I think, of eating more raw things and less things that are less cooked is probably a good idea overall. Just to mention Dean Ornish's work in his lifestyle heart trial. In this trial, in 1 year, he was able to show catheter-proven reversal of heart disease by feeding humans a very low-fat, vegetarian-type diet, and followed people along and actually showed PET scans that showed their hearts were being perfused much better after a year and after 5 years of treatment. And there certainly are a lot of diseases here that are linked to protection with vegetarian diets: obesity, coronary disease, diabetes, colorectal cancer, lung cancer, kidney disease, and hypertension. And certainly, I don't have to review for you the cholesterol. Probably the ideal cholesterol to have throughout your life is probably about 130. If you think about it, that little Aboriginal Chinese guy out there in his rice field who doesn't get an increase in blood pressure and weight and cholesterol through his entire life, has a total cholesterol of around 130. He has a blood pressure that's running around 100, 110, 120 or so. His weight doesn't go up with age. I mean, these are really a phenomenon of Western civilization where we have diets that are so calorically dense. So that's basically that section of the talk. I do want to just mention a bit on omega-3 fatty acids because they've been in the news a lot, and then we can talk a bit about vitamin D, and then I just have a slide on kind of the whole Vita controversy that's out there. Omega-3, you want to be careful that you don't eat Nemo if you're ever in your sushi restaurant. You do want to incorporate healthy oils into your diet, and including olive oil, and probably even healthier is canola oil, because canola oil is high in omega-3s. It's called canola oil because it was developed in Canada. And what it is the rapeseed was a seed that was considered dangerous, and because it had uric acid in it. The Canadians were smart enough to take that seed to Canada. It was a seed that just yielded a tremendous amount of oil, and genetically breed it so that it had no uric acid in it. But it does have a lot of omega-3 in it. It's a great source of vegetable omega-3. In terms of long-chain fatty acids, we get these from fish, but where the fish are getting them is actually from algae that they're eating at the bottom of the ocean. And if somebody did want to be a vegetarian, you could get these long-chain fatty acids from algal-derived long chain. So you could get your DHA and EPA directly from algae itself if you don't want to take it through a fish. I think that if you look at how these agents work, if you have the human system is pretty simple actually. When it has an immune system trigger, whether it's an infection, injury, or allergic reaction, what it does is it releases fatty acids from membranes. And if you have a high omega-6 diet, you're going to be tending to release arachidonic acid, which is pro-inflammatory. Whereas if you have DHA and EPA, these same fatty acids are going through the exact same system, but the difference is that these prostaglandins and products, in this case, are pro-inflammatory, whereas those products are anti-inflammatory. So it's a pretty simple concept. What you're trying to do is, by having a high omega-3 diet, is you're creating a system where the substrate that your enzyme systems are working on are anti-inflammatory. So that's what the advantage of having a high omega-3 versus a high omega-6 diet is. And our diets in the U.S. have a lot of omega-6s because corn oil has tremendous amounts of omega-6 and very little omega-3. So, so your dietary fat is determining your physiologic state. Another place this plays a big role is in terms of your brain, but we'll come back to that. In terms of coronary disease, it's really quite amazing here. If you look at red blood cell, EPA, and DHA, and you look at the risk of primary cardiac arrest, those people who have the highest amounts of EPA and DHA have the absolute lowest risk of having a primary cardiac event. So you get tremendous protection by having more of these omega-3s. And it's also thought to reduce arrhythmia as well. So you're trying basically you can actually measure the amount of EPA and DHA in your red blood cell and try to get higher levels, and that seems to be protective. Just to talk a bit about brain disease, what some people don't realize is that your brain is actually 60% fat. The kind of fat in your diet makes a huge difference in terms of how your brain functions. If you're a kid and you're just being fed saturated fat from McDonald's, you have a lot of processed foods with hydrogenated fats, your brain just simply doesn't have the substrates that it needs to create a normal brain. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're just seeing these huge epidemics of depression, of ADHD in kids, and other autism and other disorders that are just increasing dramatically. There have been a number of studies very promising with looking at feeding supplements of EPA and DHA, showing just very significant efforts. Some of this work has been done by Andrew Stahl, who's a Harvard psychopharmacologist. He wrote a book called The Omega-3 Connection. And certainly, I think paying attention, actually the American Psychological Association recommends that any person who has psychological disorder should be on supplements of omega-3s. So in terms of how you get these, certainly you can use fish. You do have to eat quite a lot of fish to get significant amounts of omega-3s. It might be worth considering using pills. And it turns out here that the Costco brand, the Kirkland Signature, and members only, I think these are basically from Walmart and Sam's Club and Costco. These are actually the lowest price and seem to get very good reviews from Consumer Reports. I'm going to talk just briefly about vitamin D. I know it's kind of a controversial area these days, and there's a lot of interest in vitamin D. I think everybody's checking vitamin D levels in their patients. And
Okay, Bill.
sure.
A question about the omega-3 supplements. Is there any concern about environmental damage as far as a lot of them are obtained from fish, and the fish industry is I've heard it takes
Right. I think if
tons
you're
of
concerned with that,
sardines to
there.
make a simple pill go, that kind of thing, as far as how those, where they come from.
Yeah, well, of course, as I mentioned, you can get the algal oils from algae itself, and there's the one product called Neuramine, which is from the algae itself, but it is a very good cause because most people do get these actual fish oils. I mean, one company that has a sustainable approach to doing this is a Nordic Naturals company that's in Norway, and they have a way of harvesting the fish and bringing them into sustain. Actually, other countries have looked to Norway as a way of coming up with a sustainable fish population pattern of harvesting the fish. And so that's one company that's very ethical and does it in a way that really works. And the whole country of Norway, they've been a fishing country forever, and they have strict laws in terms of making sure that the population of fish is maintained. Sure.
Did the Consumer Lab did a review of the supplements, and unfortunately it came out that the fish oils, the contamination rate was very low. And anybody who's concerned about that can just go to consumerlab.com.
Oh, that's good. I mean, there are these external labs where most companies will actually send in samples and they'll be tested, and they post the results and find that the mercury and such is really not a big concern for most agents that you find. As far as some are encapsulated, and they'll say because it's people say they get less burp up and such, but that may actually be a lower quality oil. Because if you have a really good quality oil, it shouldn't really give you a lot of burp up. Another thing is keep the omega-3 supplements either in the freezer or even better in the fridge, or even better in the freezer, because they'll tend to be dissolved. They'll keep them fresher for one thing, and then they'll dissolve more slowly, and you'll have less problem with kind of this burp up if they make it further down before they dissolve. So keeping your omega-3s in the fridge or the freezer is a good idea too. So vitamin D just seems like it's getting just tremendous amounts of attention these days, and probably with good reason. If we look at where we want to be in terms of vitamin D, certainly we're checking a lot of our patients and they're coming in the deficient states, somewhere between 12 and 14. Insufficiency is very common. Normal levels of vitamin D, and the way this 32 is defined is where parathyroid hormones is normalized. But there's some suggestion actually that you increase strength all the way up to levels of 40, and that you reduce cancer risk up to levels of 50. if you look at, we were talking about sunshine earlier, if you look at lifeguards in Australia who are out, in the sun all day long, they have serum levels of about 100 and seem to have no toxicity or problems from having serum levels of vitamin D of about 100. There is some evidence, even though you don't consider this a treatment for osteoporosis, that you can reduce the risk of hip fracture by giving vitamin D supplements. And then here's another one looking at 58% reduction in fractures overall. So there's some suggestion actually that you can reduce the risk of fractures with vitamin D. But I want to focus a little bit on non-skeletal functions of vitamin D and some of the cool research that's come out. You know that Finland has very low sun exposure for a good part of the year. They have a very high incidence of type 1 diabetes. Just to mention this, even here in New Hampshire, from fall till spring, even lying out in the sun butt naked, you cannot make vitamin D because the angle of the sun is too low to actually cause vitamin D to be formed. So you need to take vitamin D supplements, and your patients do as well. So previous study had shown a reduced risk of diabetes in mothers who use cod liver oil in pregnancy. So they took children and they gave them 2,000 IUs of vitamin D per day, and they showed an 80% reduction in the risk of developing type 1 diabetes. So for you pediatricians out there, you might be interested in, and that's 2,000 a day. People say, oh my God, that's way too much vitamin D. Well, if you just go out in the sun for 20 minutes with a good amount of your skin exposed, you will in that one exposure make between 20 and 25,000 IUs of vitamin D. So the idea that you're taking 2,000 a day is a lot, I think, is a mistake. There is evidence that vitamin D improves strength, and this is sit to stand time versus vitamin D levels, and higher vitamin D led to improvements there, and also increases in speed and walking 8 feet for older people as well. And that slide is shown here. Higher vitamin D levels and a shorter time to walking. There's also some evidence here. I could have certainly done a whole talk on vitamin D, that you reduce risk of colon cancer with vitamin D. And you can see, in this case, continued protection probably all the way up to levels of 40. This is looking at breast cancer risk. And there's also evidence in breast cancer that countries where they have more sun exposure, that they have lower risk of breast cancer overall. But here you see protection all the way up to 50. And there is probably some reason, for optimal health to consider targeting vitamin D levels of between 50 and 60 instead of just over 32 if you really want to have optimal effects. There's also evidence, this is looking at multiple sclerosis, and we may not think of this as a disease associated with vitamin D, but in this case, those people at vitamin D levels of 40 or higher had a 62% reduction in the risk of developing multiple sclerosis. So that's, you may not think of vitamin D as being related, but it seems like it is. This is a very cumbersome slide. I'm just going to get through it quickly. But basically what it suggests is that 2,000 IUs of vitamin D per day led to oh boy, we're jumping ahead. Well, led to about a 50% reduction in neuropathic pain. So about a 60% reduction in neuropathic pain with the vitamin D. And so there's a whole lot of different diseases: hypertension, inflammation, fibromyalgia, learning and memory problems, ability to fight bacteria. A lot of this comes from tuberculosis work, where putting people in sanitariums and giving them exposure to the sun actually is probably a way, getting them out of the city and giving them more sun exposure, increase vitamin D, and it seems to have an effect in being able to fight tuberculosis. We talk about type 1 diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, infection, breast, prostate, gout, strength and coordination issues as well. So this to me is a public health crisis, and I know that we have all these plans out there. We're going to give people the 50,000 IUs of vitamin D, once or twice per week, and then we're going to send them off and we're going to recheck them. I think that it really has to be dealt with in a different way. This is totally my concept. You're not going to find this in any book out there. But what I do is I only use the 2,000 IU caps of vitamin D. These are available from either Now or from Carlson. And the nice thing with the 2,000, they tend to be really small, so it's not a big imposition for the patient. And then if the person, I check their vitamin D level and it's under 20, I give them 4,000 IUs a day as a starting dose, as their starting dose of vitamin D. If it's between 20 and 40, then I give them 2,000 IUs a day. The take-home, in terms of raising vitamin D levels, every 100 of IUs of vitamin D that you give raises serum concentration by about 1 point. So you'd expect that if somebody's level is 20 and you gave them 2,000, then you get them about up to 40 or so. Then check the vitamin D level about 12 weeks after initiating therapy. And then if the level is not at goal, whatever you've decided it's going to be, whether you're targeting a 40 or a 50, then I just go ahead and give them an extra 2,000 per day. In terms of toxicity, it's not, you don't develop toxicity unless you're taking more than 10,000 IUs per day. And I think this is a very simple approach. I think and if you look at 4,000 per day, this is 120,000 per month. And if you gave the 50,000 per week, that's 200,000 per month. So it's kind of in the same range, except you're giving it basically every day, and this person then has a plan for taking vitamin D for the rest of their lives. Instead of taking these 50,000 for 6 weeks, and then they come back 3 months later and their levels are back down to 12 again. So this gives them a plan for overall replacing their vitamin D and continuing the vitamin D for a long time. And I do have a lot of people who are taking 6,000 IUs per day. I'm finding a lot of people who are taking 4,000 IUs per day are coming back with levels of about 45, 46. And even some of those people, I'm actually still at that point giving them an extra 2,000 per day, trying to get their levels between 50 and 60. So it's this very simple approach. I don't think, for me, the idea of treating like a public health crisis with a prescription form of vitamin D that is only going to be short term is the answer. I think you need to come up with a plan that the person can take home, and even if in the end they just end up taking 2,000 IUs a day, it's still a good amount of vitamin D. And the other thing is, they may in the wintertime it's required especially more vitamin D. So remember, 100 IUs will raise the serum level by about 1 nanogram per ml. All right, I'm going to skip over that. So going back to vegetarian diets, the bottom line is death rates. So if you look at meat eaters here, if you look at heart, set them as one occasional meat eater, they'll have a significant reduction in the risk of heart disease. The fish eater seems to be the best in terms of heart disease. There seems to be some protection from occasional fish. And the vegan does okay. All-cause mortality, maybe they're not, they're having more accidents or something. They're too much in a meditative state. I'm not sure exactly what's going on there. But it does seem as if you're protecting from heart disease. So Leonardo da Vinci, we're winding down there, just 1 or 2 more slides. He was kind of a rock star of his day, but he's pretty much a vegetarian. He said, he remained obstinately and resolutely himself. He was always invited to these big parties where they always had they were killing a fatted calf every time at these parties. And amid the sumptuous carnage of the world cuisine, he preferred to dine on bread and fresh fruit, or chickpea soup, or peas cooked in almond milk, or simply a green salad. And certainly, with that kind of energy that he was getting from the plant foods, he created really the best of whatever he touched in terms of the art, whether it was painting or science or sculpture. A little bit of wine goes a long way. It turns out that if you drink, the more alcohol you drink, the lower your risk of heart disease. But when you drink more than 2 drinks per day, your risk of death from accidents outweighs the benefits. So just a few ideas. Go to the Blue Moon for lunch, actually. It's a great place to go. They have incredibly healthy food. But other ideas, have a blueberry smoothie for breakfast. You get your blueberries in for the day. I use blueberries, almond milk, stay away from from what comes out of cows, bananas, and what the hot new seed is, in case you really want to be on the cutting edge of what's going on. It's not so much flaxseed anymore, it's actually chia. Chia is an incredible source of protein, of fiber. If you have anybody who has digestive problems, this stuff is like manna from heaven because it creates this like gel in the GI system that just it's just amazing in terms of treating anybody who has digestive problems. So it gives you omega-3s, gives you protein, and gives you this remarkable, like, highly viscous fiber. And put a tablespoon or two in your smoothie in the morning, and you'll never have digestive issues again. For lunch, do a big, colorful salad, with beans on it, and then for dinner, healthy protein, greens, whole grains. And I do think that if you want to, preserve those pigments, actually, having at least a couple of these meals a day as more or less raw foods as opposed to cooked food is probably the ideal thing. I think we really destroy a lot of the potential benefits of plants by overcooking them. So eat whole grains, eat healthy oils, lots of fruits and vegetables, healthy protein, alcohol in moderation. Taking calcium is not a bad idea. Multivitamins, omega-3s, some vitamin D supplementation, and this is from Live to 100 by that guy John Robbins, who I mentioned earlier. Get to ideal weight and stay there, and a lot of these ideas. Little or no processed foods, fresh foods, limit canned foods, somewhat low fat with fats from the seeds and the nuts, protein primarily from plant sources, legumes, seeds, and nuts. And you can live to be 100. I just want one more slide, actually. I just want to kind of mention a bit on the whole Valletta pancreatitis issue. I think somebody needs to tell the FDA that people with obesity and diabetes and high triglycerides are at high risk for pancreatitis. If you look at the registration trials, they were fairly small trials, but there was no increase in pancreatitis cases. If you look at the 700,000 people who have been prescribed Valletta, in that population there does not seem to be any increased risk of pancreatitis. In fact, the risk may be lower. And someone needs to inform the FDA again that these people are at risk for pancreatitis. And I really think that these cases that they're throwing out there, and just which are just getting all this incredible press coverage, are really not doing anybody any favors. I just don't think the numbers are there to suggest that pancreatitis is higher in people who are on Valletta. So anyway, that's it. Thanks so much for your attention. Appreciate you coming this morning.
Is it important that the form of vitamin D be D3?
D3, there is some evidence that D3 has better receptor activity than D2. But the Michael Hollick, who's a big expert at VU, says that there really isn't a difference. But I try to push my patients towards the D3 instead of the D2. Yeah.
What is it in the blueberries that's so beneficial?
Well, it's really, the short answer is the anthocyanins, and those are the blue pigments, what gives the blueberries their blue color. And if you look at the structure of anthocyanins, it's basically two rings with a double bond connected to two other rings, and it makes it a perfect a free radical quencher. So you can have free radicals that are absorbed into these rings and protect these free radicals from hitting DNA and so on. So it's thought to be what protects the plant in nature, what gives the plant the blue color, and others that are very high. Blue seems to be very protective. Like if you look at grapes, Concord grapes are incredibly high in anthocyanins. 32 different kinds of anthocyanins, very much like blueberries, which have about over 30 different types of anthocyanins, and it's highly concentrated form. So I do think that Concord grapes are also, and even Concord grape juice is very good as well. There are studies with Concord grape juice actually that show improvements in memory as well.
Dried fruits, do they maintain their nutritional value?
Yeah, generally if they haven't been heated, if they've simply been dried, they tend to be more concentrated. If you want to get super high levels of what's this borax, actually the dried fruits are the best. The dried fruits are the best. Yeah.
Is there any danger in taking vitamin D if you haven't checked levels?
No, no, I mean, vitamin D assays are expensive, they cost about $300 to do. And, you know, if somebody has no insurance, or you just don't want to drive the cost of overall, you know, healthcare up, I think just going ahead and giving people 2,000 to 4,000 IUs of vitamin D per day is fine. And you don't have to check vitamin D levels on everybody.
Does the freezing process, freezing fruits and vegetables?
Freezing is fine, actually. Freezing doesn't destroy the anthocyanins at all. So it's actually not a bad way to go. And usually for blueberries, they're too expensive for people who afford fresh, but the frozen are awesome. Make your smoothies with the blue frozen ones.
Anybody that you would not put on Viagra because of this information?
If they have a history of pancreatitis, then I'd be careful. But even that, I think if you've got some guts, I think you might still do it.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your attention.
Sure.